Assalamualaikum, I am Nur Hidayah binti Zainal Arabi and my number matrix is 278764. For the introduction, Singapore is a small country but in the economic sector is the largest in Asia and the most advanced country in South Asia. The open economic attitude for the whole country used by Singapore is a factor in the country's progress. Singapore opens market like investment is vital to their economy. This is because Singapore is a small country that lacks a natural resource. But Singapore used the country's advantage as the easiest place to do a business in the world, and Singapore has also successfully transformed from the developed economy to developed economy. Therefore, trade in Singapore became the most important economic resource of the country. Countries that invest a lot of in Singapore are China, Malaysia, and United States, and many more, especially in the trade sector. In 2020, there will be a decrease in investment in the goods in Singapore, but it will only the temporary because in Assalamualaikum, I am Nur Hidayah binti Zainal Arabi and my number matrix is 278764.
Assalamualaikum, I'm Nurfazila binti Jaina with matrix number 27X008. So I'm going to explain about how Singapore's economic response to COVID-19 in international trade. In 2019, where the COVID-19 pandemic began, Singapore's GDP rate was very low. This has kept Singapore from taking steps to fight for their international trade or economy. Prior to COVID-19, a conference called the Future Economic Committee (CEE) involving 9,000 important parties was organized as early as 2016 to provide the best opportunities for enterprises and employees to succeed in the open world. Singapore gave a strong immediate reaction to the coronavirus pandemic. Anyone known to have visited mainland China was barred from entering Singapore on 31 January 2020. It is because the Ministry of Health of Singapore at that time offered an update on contact tracing by detecting as many as 11 cases. Second, following the SARS pandemic in 2002 and 2004, Singapore tried to ensure that medical personnel had proper and adequate protective equipment. In the early stages, they also produced a PCR test kit using a genome that was released by China in January. Next, the situation worsened in the second half of March, where there was an alarming rate of infection among migrant workers living in hostels, and there were infections imported from the West. As such, the National University of Singapore has decided to limit face-to-face classes to 25 students compared to the previous 50. Singapore's actions have proven that Singapore views the need to address the pandemic as crucial, as they clearly do not see the situation as a symmetrical trade between life and way of life. And next, for budgets totaling 100 billion Singapore dollars, which are 20% of GDP, were announced in the months between February and June, which aims to provide support to firms, especially SMEs, to get various assistance in terms of financial need, rent, and salary costs to keep their members in employment. Singapore's approach to tackling COVID-19 is a socialist intervention and a laissez-faire capitalist that believe in market power, individual responsibility, and government. There is a belief in market forces, but also an understanding that markets do not clear quickly enough in certain circumstances. Market discovery can take too long when there is structural change and radical uncertainty. And there is a belief in individual responsibility, but also an understanding that the government needs to address coordination failures.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Nusra Al-Hashim Hamidi Muhammad Ilyas, matric number 279899. For the financial assistance, Singaporean citizens are very lucky as they only have to pay 1/3 of the price. Singaporeans aged 40 years old only pay 12% of the price of goods. Singaporeans carrying small and medium enterprises, SMEs, have employees under 40. Employers only have to. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Nusra Al-Hashim. Roadmaps and hubs. The Singapore set up the Task Force Emerging Stronger Task Force EST, covering 15 senior executives under the responsibility of the Ministry of Trade and Industry of Singapore. From hub to platform and collab lab. Singapore is known as a company providing a platform as well as connecting cooperation in various sectors. Example, Hyundai Motor builds an electric vehicle factory EV in Singapore. This is because Singapore is a techno-nationalism since the US-China competition takes place. The United States is the largest investor in Singapore and China is the destination for the investment out of Singapore. Singapore is smart to take advantage of the US-China conflict. Examples, the holding company of TikTok by ByteDance, Alibaba and Tencent announced a large investment in Singapore in 2020. Digital innovation from China company set up a global headquarters in Singapore. A 3M company from American company that makes the N95 facial mask also operate in Singapore. Trade agreements. Singapore has established trade relations with other countries through trade agreements. For example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership (TPP) between New Zealand, Brunei, Singapore, and Chile in 2005. In April 2020, Singapore Foreign Minister was flying to New Zealand to carry out diplomacy with the country. Singapore helps companies take advantage of the Singapore FTA network, which is evident in the annual FTA Day organized by the Singapore Business Federation and the Minister of Trade. Digital Economic Agreement is preferred to ensure that IT standard operations are among the countries. By the end of 2020, Singapore began reopening the flight door for foreign countries to come to Singapore as stated in the trade agreement. Singapore's GDP is shrinking in the second quarter of 2020, 13% smaller than the second quarter of 2019. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum to Doctor. My name is Nurul Zarifah binti Muhammad and my metric number is 281135. Next, I will talk about the impact on food security. Food security is defined when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Each component of Singapore's food supply chains has been severely impacted by the outbreak, including food imports, domestic food production, retail grocers, food and beverage services, and assistance for the neediest. Singapore's primary food source is import, with local production of vegetables, chicken eggs, and fish serving as a supplement. Singapore's physical and financial access to food is threatened by any interruption of international trade, since importing food is the primary method by which Singapore assures food availability. Concerns have been raised because interruption in supply chains and government policies to limit exports or stockpile goods can have a significant impact on food security. Singapore promptly contacted its trading partners and demanded global agreements to safeguard supply chain connectivity. According to Department of Statistics Singapore in 2020, imported food costs increased, which affected final consumer food prices. From February to May 2020, the average monthly price of imported food product was regularly 3 to 4% higher than it was during the same time last year. Prices kept going up as the coronavirus situation proceeded to get worse on a worldwide scale. Imported food and live animal cost 0.3% more in July 2020 compared to June. Retailers and restaurants absorbed these increased prices before turning them into food inflation for end customer in July of 2.2% year over year. This specifically entails a rise in the cost of a number of necessary food items such as livestock and a range of other fundamental necessities like bread and grains. All components of the food service like fast food, hawker food prices, catered food, and restaurant food saw inflation that averaged over 1%. Increased costs have subsequently made food less affordable from an economical perspective. From the first picture above, for example, in the last quarter of 2020, the Consumer Price Index or CPI for food in Singapore was 101.9. This was an increase by 1.9 index point compared to the base year 2019. On the second picture, in 2020, between the first and second quarters, food index points were 0.8 index points lower. By the second quarter of 2021, there had been an increase of 1.5 index point compared to the first quarter in 2020.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, Doctor. My name is Nur Nabila binti Muhammad Muzaffar, metric number 278574, and I will continue about the impact of COVID-19 on Singapore's trade based on the services. The categories of exports in the services included business services, transport services, financial services, and telecommunication, computer and information services. Singapore's service exports fell by 1.6% in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 epidemic, especially in the travel services export with 74.2%. The reason of the drop was because of the buying and using the products and services by visitors to Singapore for a brief period. However, border restrictions imposed by several nations throughout the world allowed the travel services to resume their operations. Even throughout the pandemic, Singapore's service exports in the category of use of intellectual property, telecommunications, computer and information services, other business services and financial services grew. Since many of these services could be provided to customers remotely, they were less affected by the epidemic. This pandemic also has made an improvements for digital transformation among the country, therefore assisting Singapore's exports of information, computer and telecommunication services. The change to online business platforms has also benefited Singapore's financial services exports, which were rising during the pandemic. The border restrictions in the global has led both the number of air passengers and sea passengers falling steeply in 2020. In 2021, the total of air cargo has recovered. This is because of the strong demand in the certain services that needed the use of it, such as e-commerce, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. Sea cargo can be seen still resilient throughout the pandemic and the pre-pandemic level. The exports of the transportation increased during the pre-pandemic because of the strong recovery in the air cargo and sea freight. Aside from these sea freight transportation services, overall transport services in the country saw a recovery in the pre-pandemic level.
For conclusion, the occurrence of COVID-19 in 2019 is due to have impact on the Singapore economy, especially trade sector. In 2020, there will be the decrease in investment in goods in Singapore, but it will be only a temporary because in 2021, Singapore will be able to increase trade in the goods in Singapore again. This is because Singapore has an efficient government to overcome the problem. That's a key suddenly and quickly implement various incentives for the society and the national economy. An effective government and system in Singapore is able to have a positive effect on the economy and social control so that it does not affect the entire country of Singapore in the long term. That's all from us. Thank you.